Hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to virtually be here with all of you. My name is Nick Goulette. I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization in Trinity County called the Watershed Research and Training Center, or by the Watershed Center for shorthand. I was invited to talk with you all about strategic landscape planning for prescribed fire. And it's a topic I've had keen interest in over years and have spent a fair bit of time working with a number of models for strategic planning. And so that's what I'm hoping to share with you all today is kind of multiple pathways for incorporating landscape thinking and landscape planning into your prescribed fire planning. A little background on myself before I dive in here. Trained as a forester, but I am not a practicing registered professional forester in California. Also have training as a fire manager, but I'm not a professional firefighter. However, I've spent last decade working on building and implementing a prescribed fire program with a number of partners in Trinity County. Been deeply involved with the formation and operations in Northern California Prescribed Fire Council, and do work around the state trying to help other organizations and community-based partnerships and their agency partners build out cooperative prescribed fire initiatives. So that's a little background on myself and what I'm bringing to this conversation. I'll draw on a number of examples from our Trinity County work in this talk. But I think it's important to know that this kind of work is going on all around the state, all around the West, and the models of planning that I will frame up are entirely of my own conception. And so hopefully they'll provide a useful sort of frame for you all when you're thinking about what role landscape planning is in your role as professional foresters working with landowners and working with partners, planning and implementing prescribed fire. So with that, I'll get started here. My outline for this talk, just a little context on why landscape planning matters. It's probably intuitive for many of you because you work in a landscape context when you're working with private landowners, but I'll provide a little framing. Exploring the range of approaches from complex to simple. And so I'll run through, again, what is my conception of the sort of different levels of landscape planning, ranging from simple to more complex, from cheap to very expensive, and some of the strengths and weaknesses and sort of applications for these different planning approaches. And wrap up with a little summary and some parting thoughts. So, why landscape planning matters? Some of the criticism we hear around prescribed fire as a starting place, there is a feeling that we're not implementing prescribed fire at a scale that's meaningful to have an impact on fire behavior, fire risk. An idea that a lot of our projects around prescribed fire are sort of one-offs. They're not replicable. They're not connected over space and time. And so they don't amount to anything more than a project. And when we're thinking in the landscape context, we're thinking about affecting landscape trajectories and fire resilience or productivity. And so I think there's some reasonable justification that and criticism around whether we're doing small projects in isolation or whether we're doing the work of landscape resilience through our planning and implementation of prescribed fire. We want to align with broader land management strategy to really optimize the impact. If we're not trying to do one-offs and sort of postage stamp projects, then this alignment is really important. As foresters, you all think and work across landscape boundaries already, even if you're working with an individual landowner. So I hope this is sort of intuitive, but working across land ownerships really is the name of the game in today's world, whether that's to be competitive for funding or just to get to scale and impact. prescribed fire has some really unique dimensions that make working across boundaries especially important, like that sort of risk sharing, dealing with potential escapes or slop overs, smoke impacts, all of which really raise red flags and warrant that broader landscape, multiple landowner approach. Expanding the geographic scope of the work is absolutely critical if we're trying to have an impact, obviously, on fire resilience. And then there's this leveraging and stacking of investments. We really want to find ways to align our work across multiple land ownerships and multiple sort of funding streams. Again, to get to sort of landscape scale outcomes versus just project level and unit level outcomes. And then, you know, we live in a world where not all of our work is driven by just sort of productivity and a landowner's bottom line with timber harvest, for instance. When we're incorporating prescribed fire, we're usually bridging over into public benefit components to the work, where we're trying to, again, get to broader landscape impact, so multi-landowner landscape level fire resilience. Or if we're working on, let's say, forest land ownership productivity or even resilience, we're still thinking about access and cost share programs and grants. And if we want to be more competitive, it really requires this landscape approach to our thinking. I provide the maps to the right here just as sort of an example. This is a Trinity County landscape around the Weaver Basin, outside of Weaverville. You can just see this sort of this broader multi-landowner context we live in. We've got the pink or industrial timber landowners, the purple are smaller private holdings, the green is Forest Service, the pink is BLM. And so how do we do anything that has any real impact on resources at scale? It's by working across these boundaries. So this is my first sort of category or scale of planning, and it is the least costly and probably the most commonly, I think, deployed kind of landscape planning approach, which is, you know, we're intuitive and opportunistic, and we're trying to find opportunities to incorporate prescribed fire into work we're already doing or landowners we're already working with. And so this is something that I think is really a natural fit for professional foresters who have the knowledge and background and training that you have around landscape ecology and forest ecology and management. And so I think we do this all the time. And so this is about drawing on professional expertise and knowledge. Almost always will be informed by watershed, fireshed, harvest, or community planning. And almost everything we do out there incorporates or is nested under existing planning, and drawing on those plans and being aware of them to help inform what we're doing at a site or an individual landowner level, I think is something we all do naturally. And so the example I provide on the right here, one of the first prescribed fire planning and implementation projects we did in the Trinity County in the Hayfork area was really tiered down from what was a watershed planning process. So we were planning for the municipal watershed for Hayfork. This is Big Creek Watershed. It's about a 30,000 acre landscape. We were looking at how we deal with threats to that watershed, fire, of course, being chief among them. We did a whole bunch of analysis around water resources, but where water resources and fire kind of crossed, we really looked for opportunities to design projects that could have an impact to protect water resources. It also so happened that, so we head down here to the lower end of the watershed and we're on private lands, this Big Creek Ranch, this map, large private land holding. It so happened that we found an opportunity here to use prescribed fire to protect our community water source, Ewing Reservoir, to align with landowner objectives for range improvement across this ranch, and to also hit on community wildfire protection objectives. This is a major ridge that sort of breaks up the Hayfork Valley east to west, and so incorporating fuels reduction treatments across that landscape made a ton of sense. And so this planning effort wasn't about prescribed fire, but you can see how prescribed fire projects sort of flowed out of both a landscape planning approach, but also just some really intuitive and opportunistic planning, where we happened to have a good relationship with this landowner. We knew that he had some overlapping objectives that could also meet these public benefit objectives. And so incorporating landscape thinking, scaling down to the landowner level, but also then designing prescribed fire projects that could have a real landscape impact. There was very little cost associated with the landscape planning for prescribed fire in this component. It was really, again, a sort of output of another planning process that then we focused down at the individual land ownership level. This is about 1,000 acres that you're looking at on the map to the right. So it gives you a sense of scale. The next example I'll draw is what I would consider a more data-informed cooperative planning model. So the example I'm providing on the right here is again out of the Weaver Basin. And so in this effort, we really were planning explicitly for the utilization of prescribed fire as a tool. So we've got our community wildfire protection plan in Trinity County. The Forest Service has strategic planning processes that they undertake. They incorporate things like fire probability, so where are the fire starts most likely to happen, and what does the fire behavior look like? And then we're thinking about how to optimize outcomes for community protection, sort of coupled with landowner objectives. So when you look at this map, you've got Highway 299 running through and out of Weaverville. This is where our high probability of ignition is. We have westerly winds that come off the Trinity River Canyon and blow down into Weaverville. We have a history of large fires and damaging fires here. And so we were incorporating community wildfire protection, fire suppression planning, and really thinking about how to design a strategy that incorporated prescribed fire to reduce those risks. And so the landowner level planning then really came down to, okay, we've got this mixed ownership landscape. Let's get out there and talk to these landowners. The Forest Service in green, you can see their project areas are in this darker green. So they had already sort of incorporated prescribed fire at scale into their strategy here. What the Watershed Center was able to do with our foresters was basically go and talk to the adjacent industrial timberland owners, Sierra Pacific Industries, Trinity River Lumber Company, and some smaller private landowners that buffer out the community here. One of these is a private arts foundation that has some holdings, our public utility district, and then some smaller private landowners, and really develop what becomes a landscape strategy for thinning and prescribed fire that has a community protection, a timber resource protection component to it, and is, again, data informed and tiering directly to some resource management plans for fire hazard reduction. So that is an example of a more data informed cooperative planning approach to prescribed fire. And we've been able to parlay that into cross-boundary prescribed fire implementation on federal and private lands in this landscape because it was part of this cooperative landscape scale planning approach. That provided a jumping off point towards a different form of implementation, which I think is an important part to think about, right? Because planning is always an opportunity to lay the groundwork for cooperative implementation. The final example I'll provide here is what I would consider a far more data-driven landscape planning approach. And this example is from the southern Sierra Nevada, from the Forest Service's work on forest plan revisions down there. But I think and it uses a certain set of analytical tools that are, very specific and were designed for very specific purposes. But I think the take home from this data-driven landscape planning approach is that you can incorporate a lot of really whiz-bang technology, geospatial planning approaches, and modeling tools into analyzing risk and analyzing how you optimize the use of fuels treatments to get the very best impact on fire suppression and management. And this planning approach, this is a national forest system-wide approach. This can be scaled down to really any size landscape. I think the bottom line here is that it requires a lot of technical expertise. It has substantial costs and time associated with it, but it also turns out really strong justifications for the work that you will plan and implement. And so if you think about these planning approaches as a continuum from intuitive, opportunistic to heavily data-informed, the defensibility of the specific places that you try to place prescribed fire treatments, of course, changes, from what is, anyone's best guess based on expertise to what the computer tells you based upon an aggregation of expertise and knowledge and science over decades, right? Because these models are that. They're the incorporation of years of expertise and knowledge and science. And so while they may be hard to access and they may be costly and they may take time, they provide you with really good outputs and really great direction that then again is heavily defensible. And so if you're getting into situations where you have to muster massive public resources, for instance, big grants, broad public support because you're going to have a big smoke impact, or you're going to provide or you're going to be operating in an environment that provides substantial risk to neighbors, neighboring properties, to communities, the rigor of your landscape planning becomes more and more important. And so this sort of toolkit of quantitative risk assessment and extensive and complex fire modeling that's been incorporated into these forest planning processes, that's not attainable for everybody, but when you think about the purpose, it's a forest plan, so it is a NEPA analyzed document that has to essentially get the highest level of sort of sign off and public scrutiny, the sophistication of your landscape planning goes up. So take homes here. I think that it's important to understand, one size doesn't really fit all. Some of you, I'm sure, have the capabilities to incorporate sophisticated fire modeling and landscape planning, geospatial landscape planning tools into your prioritization. Many of you likely participate in sort of collaborative processes or cooperative partnerships where there's a whole level of cross-agency and cross-landowner cooperation that goes into your landscape planning. I think the take-home is that there is no one right or best way. It really is about scaling your landscape planning to the context you're operating in, calibrating that to the needs and opportunities and the resources you have available. There is nothing wrong with the first example I provided, which is tiering prescribed fire to a pre-existing landscape plan and working with a willing and motivated landowner. That is a first step towards working on the neighbor's property and the other neighbor's property and really scaling to the landscape scale your prescribed fire planning and implementation. And so I think the message here is you all are trained professionals with the right kind of background to utilize intuitive and opportunistic landscape planning to get prescribed fire on the ground. You also know and participate in circumstances where there are a broader suite of tools available and resources available, and where there is more need for more rigorous landscape planning. There are a wide range of examples out there of this whole continuum of planning approaches that I've just outlined in brief. And so drawing on your colleagues and neighbors and finding the approach that's right for you, honing your own skills towards the planning approach that you're most likely to be incorporating into your professional practice in the future. Those are the recommendations I'd leave you with. So with that, I will call it a wrap and look forward to the live webinar where there'll be some opportunity for question and answer and dialogue. It's great to be here with you all. Thanks.